And in this week, we're going to talk about infrastructure, security, and control. Some of the material is probably review from CIS 27 and other security classes. We'll focus a little bit more on how this play into the analysis part of your course concept. So, in the first part of the notes, it talks about defense in depth, and we know that by layering security in building out your security plan or solutions need to have different areas, right? It's not really entailing one area like access management. It really comes down to physical, technical, and administrative control. So defense in depth it really means that you have overlapping control in developing or implementing your security solutions for your organization. And when we're looking at issues, right, a lot of the things that we do really fall into the technical control, but we always want to think about the parallel or the correlation in how we address the security issue. So, in the first question, it asks you to describe and provide an example of security controls using defense in depth strategy or approach. One, we know that technical control, that there is a lot for us to manage because that's the area that we work in. So in the IT department or in the security operations center, you typically would configure your systems, right? Would implement the rules, and these rules would correlate, it would be parallel to what's written on your policy. So let's say that we have um, access, like user access policy, where we would say that user can only access, right, web application with a certain credential, for example. Then that means that we have to configure the web application, we have to implement authentication, and the certificate. With that, we have to implement certificate authority, right, to be able to help us manage, right, that web application in a secure way. Also, we need to be able to think about how that web application would have flaws. We would implement input validation. So the technical control really means that you would configure, you would set the settings, you would change the firewall rules, you would be able to set up the criteria for your detective systems or your prevention system to respond to certain threats. So that's going to help us, one, prevent internal threat that is harder to detect. We talked about that before. And two, to prevent the external threat. So the security appliance is really straightforward, right? It's either going to block or allow based on the rules. So, for example, I would allow, right, certain connections from the internet with appropriate IP address that is accepted in my networks. I would block, right, uh, unknown IP address. So what you can do is you can create an access control list and set up where certain IP addresses are going to be accepted. So those are like the type of rules that we would set up in the technical area. Now, in the administrative control, usually we would have written documentation and we would follow that with the organizational practices and mission and goals to make sure that it is going to correlate, right? And so we want to provide security training for the user, the staff, even the IT people with professional development to make sure that we have appropriate security practices, right? And because, the human area, sometimes that can be a flaw or vulnerability in our organization. So you always want to have the technical area, the technical control, the administrative control, and then sometime we want to think about the physical control. That means that we want to secure our assets. Um, Having locks to buildings, fences, lighting, right, surveillance systems, barricades, security guards, um, or smart card access system to be able to manage specific physical access to doors, to critical systems, and so on, right? So this is going to help us protect our assets. One, the building that holds the people, and your system, the system holds the data, which are also assets. So you have to really think about the priority and the assets in the physical area is important. So when we're looking at things like, in the case of emergency, how do we respond to an incident that could be just only, right, impacting the physical area, like fire, earthquake, right? Or that could be human threat when, you have bomb threats on how we would clear the building, or fire, how the fire extinguisher would be use, but then at the same time, that can also damage our systems and data. Or even cooling, right? Heating, cooling, and so on, because our server system needs to have certain temperature. So, physical, administrative, and technical control are the three primary components that you always think about for security planning using defense in depth. So, when you're looking at the model, before we kind of dive into this, we need to look at this picture. The reason why data is at the center is you have to kind of think about, like, one, we talked about data as assets, but data, not because it is valuable, we use the system to be able to, number one, input data, two, to generate data, right? Um, so therefore, data security is really the centric in this particular model. So when we think about data security, that really means that, one, we want to make sure that there's integrity. Two, right, with that, we have to have confidentiality on who is accessing the data. And then with that, we span out and we think about the systems that are being used to access the data. Your web applications, right? Your server system hold the data. Your endpoint systems or your user systems that are accessing the data. But in order to access the data, the way that we interface the data is through the application. So therefore, the next level is going to be your application security, right? And the application resides on the system because the computer system is its job is to, number one, take input, two, generate output, right? And the way that we do this is either through the terminal, which is still an application. Your operating system is still an application where you can manage your files, which is data. So your system security is also an element, and all systems are interconnected, right? We don't really have a standalone system in a functional organization. All your system needs to be connected from your sales terminal all the way to your database server, your application server, your web server. So your network security is the next level. And then with that, we have to also protect the network. So the network is part of the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is also going to belong to the physical area, the building, right? The data center, multiple locations spanning from could be one country to the next or across the nation. So what you see is for number two, right? If we're looking at that model, we start with data security. And one thing that we can do is to use encryption. Now, encryption is only effective if you are properly managing the key. And encryption is effective if you select the proper algorithms. But encryption just buys us time. So there's typically two forms of encryption that's being used in a lot of our platforms, right? One, we stream encryption. So that means that it encrypts one bit at a time, right? You learned this in CIS 27. So a lot of the web application that you use when you go into HTTPS, right? You log in, you have a session, you process your bill payment, or you access your financial aid, right? With that, you have data encryption, but it's going to be a streaming encryption, right? And in other cases, you might have to encrypt data as a file, right? Sometimes you use an algorithm that is chunking up your data and it's encrypting that by blocks. So data encryption is probably the base, and we would encrypt based on different classes. Do I need to encrypt the public class? No, right? Public data is available to everyone, and it would be the type of data that doesn't hold private information. Whereas if you have private data or confidential data, right? Different level of data, then you need to make sure that there's protection. Okay. So why do we need user account information like your transactions to be encrypted and protected? Because we don't want someone to impersonate you to be able to access your account. So we have to think about classification of data. So how do I know which to encrypt? Go to your data classification policy, like what I said about before, right? Technical and administrative control, and to determine the classes of data that you need to protect. Now, that's only one element of data security, right? There are other things that we need to consider, but encryption plays a big role in protecting your data. The second level in that model is your application security. The majority of the application now is web app. Okay. Even if you use system with native OS and so on, as you know already, Microsoft, right? Your Chromebooks, all of these systems have integrated to use web applications. So one area for all type of application is we can control it by using input validation techniques. How you're going to be able to do that is through the development process. We want to see how we can control what can be entered to prevent script from being injected into your application, right? So we can prevent cross-site scripting if it is a web app, right? There are other scripts that can, be used for hijacking and other things. So we want to make sure that an element that we can implement, a control that we can implement is input validation. But web application can be flawed, right? Or an application can be flawed based on the services that it uses. So you need to monitor the services. That's another control that we can implement. We can think about, we can also do code testing and making sure that there's not a way that, the application can have additional flaws to create additional problem. The third part of the model is your endpoint system security. And so physically, we can think about how we can have an anti-theft mechanism built in. A lot of the companies use remote lock, meaning that if I issue a laptop to my user goes to the coffee shop, leaves the laptop unattended, that laptop gets picked up, As soon as that laptop is reported, we can remote lock that systems, right? We can also encrypt the storage that's containing the data on that system, and making sure that even if it falls into the wrong hand, because ultimately data is what they want, like not just the hardware. The hardware is just a minimum cost. The data on that system is what a lot of the people want when these things, you don't want that leaked. Okay. And then we can also use security application to control malware. Um, and a way that you can do this is you can implement servers to check the health of that system, right? When, let's say, mobile devices, in order to connect to the wireless network, it would have to go through the screening process. You can also manage with zone control. So in the screening process, you want to look for things like if there's anti-malware application that's installed, right? There any kind of configuration or changes that can impact our network? And so in some company, this is more prevalent than others. So this is like a couple areas that you can implement in your endpoint security, your endpoint system security. Now, in the network security, first we can add in the boxes, the security appliances. That's going to help us control the perimeter, right? Meaning that we can detect and prevent using security appliances. We can also implement access management. And I truly believe that this is an area that a lot of the times we fall down in security, from credential all the way to the physical access of your network, like cabling, on how this is connecting together. Things needs to be having performance, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we control the traffic. So monitoring and prioritizing traffic using load balancing is going to help us overall. Any question? Okay. Then the last part of your model is the perimeter security. And this plays back into your physical security area. Having a lot of the mechanism that's going to help us, slow down, reduce the risk to where it is acceptable, right? Fire suppression system is not going to give you 100% foolproof, okay? You might suppress fire. A lot of the time we use water system because it's human friendly. But at the same time, the risk of that is if your computers are on, if your servers are on, right? The sprinklers start to go. A lot of the times you might have damage in your system. So you gotta think about like your failover cluster and your backup. So in that case, no matter what happens in an incident, we are gonna have data loss, right? Um, Even if you do like regular backup, when you roll back, you will likely have some kind of loss. It's it, you know, it's rare that you have 100% data recovery, and when you lose time in that gap, you lose money. So either way, we lose financially. Any question? Okay. So, zero trust wasn't added to the questions, but you can go through. Basically, it talks about removing the trust that's used on the system devices and individuals. So let's take an example, right? We have autonomous system. Autonomous system is configured to trust one another. So that way it can pass data, it can communicate, it can automate the service for your network and your operation. And this is definitely convenient. for us, right? But over time, you have to reevaluate this trust because someone, right, can go in and set up another system that mimic exactly what your system is and take over that trust. So in a zero trust model, what we see is that we have to really think about that trust, right? And the disclose of information or the exchange of data through the services, and even when you're thinking about people, right? So in the security boundaries, removing that trust might create some challenges in the efficiency and also the convenience. However, right, that's going to help you reevaluate some of the areas, the flaws in your systems, your people, and your operations. Okay. Now, in the next part, it talks about segmentation. Before we talk about bash and host and jump box and all of those things. So I really feel that this is a really big area for network defense. If you're not segmenting, right, then you're going to have problems. So, for example, if I have a private network and my private network have critical systems, if I'm not separating different areas of my private network, what's going to happen is my data, my systems are going to be vulnerable to the people within your insider threats. Now, segmentation can be that you can have a virtual LAN, right? Designated for specific things. So, for example, when we're looking at like a car dealership, you have the people who approve car loans, you have the sales people that's on the floor, you have some managers that's going to approve the sales, right? That's technically it. And then you have the workers that are preparing the cars or receiving the cars as they're coming in to be sold. So we have to really think about the process to really understand what's needed in the segmentation. Because when you isolate an area, number one, is it really needed? Two, what are you trying to protect, right? So in an environment like a car dealership, you want to isolate the financial people, right, from the sales department, the marketing, right, the management group, and also the workers who are there, the staff that's supporting the operation for that dealership. Or if we're looking at the school like this, right, you have segmentation for the student side versus the staff and the faculty side because we want to make sure that we protect certain systems that have both attendance, grade, your financial aid, private information, and so forth, right? So it talks about virtual segmentation. And when you're looking at cloud environment, which we talked about before, right, in the last week, this really plays a critical area because everybody uses cloud because it's affordable. It saves money for the company. And even within that, what you see is you have virtual environment, you have virtual servers, you have segmentation within that is set up to really separate right different areas so that way we can control what is being accessed, which system, right, and how it's being accessed. So what you see is that in cloud environment, you don't just have instances as virtual machines, you also have containers, right? We learned about Docker before in our labs. That's a form of container. Basically, it's a designated storage that we use for specific things. That could be for database, it could be for your servers, it could be for testing, reverse engineering, or Kubernetes, which is what you see a lot on a lot of these jobs. And so, what we can, instead of separating the physical server, we can use the same server on the racks. But logically, virtually, we are separating right ports. Right on the switch, you can say, okay, port 1 to 12, that's going to be designated for the finance department, and that's on a certain virtual LAN. Whereas port 13 to 24, that's going to be for the marketing department. So the systems that are connecting to these ports, they are segregated, right? They're separated from each area, so that way you don't have right overlapping and who can have access to what. So that's important to think about. You need to really compartmentalize to making sure that you can control the scope of which system and which data is being accessed. Yeah. Yeah, or even virtual machines, right? Instances on the switch, you might have a 24 port switch. You can group up certain ports for certain department, right? And those systems that are connecting to that switch, phone, computers, etc., is even though it's on the same switch, you can configure it to be separate. So if it's a layer 4 switch, in order to go from my finance department to my marketing department, it has to go through the routing part of the switch. That's how virtual LAN works. It treats it like separate little networks, okay? And it needs to route it back into the central network. The reason why we do that is you can monitor. It's a lot easier to compartmentalize and monitor each department, right? So if there's an attack on port 11, you already know that that's VLAN 1, and VLAN 1 belongs to the finance department. Whereas you're trying to figure out, oh, which port, right, on the 48 port switch or 24 port switch is harder. Both. So the majority of your cloud systems your servers are running on virtual machines on the cloud. So that's on someone else's racks, right? And then some of them are using Kubernetes or Docker to within that to control, the access to specific data or certain area of that system. So when last week you guys did Shodan, right? You looked into a lot of the clouds, right? If you look at the software that it's pulling up, a lot of them, the majority of them are all virtualized software, like the software hypervisor. Okay, so the key players are Microsoft, right? What you see is Hyper-V, VMware for vSphere and other products they use to accommodate. Most of these servers are spun on in virtual machines, okay? Linux or Windows. And that's what you see. Okay? So you are going to have a mix of different technology, going back to Nima's question, that when you look at an infrastructure today, you are going to have cloud systems, and in your cloud system, you're going to have virtualized instances, which is what we see as virtual machines, like Amazon EC2, right? And also containers, right? And that's very typical. Okay. Um, Other questions? So here, what we can do with segmentation, it's really, we can drill down the attack surface quicker, right? So if you are analyzing, it's a lot easier to really think about like what part of the network is, and then you can, if you isolate it, you can regulate a lot of the traffic. So if it's being passed through proxy, so you can control that. So for example, if you're driving on the freeway, right, if the right lane has an accident, if we have an efficient way to get everybody to detour to other lanes quicker, right, wouldn't that be more convenient to fix the issue in the right lane? So segmentation does that. It allows us to really control like the smaller part of our network versus, so when you're looking at enterprise infrastructure, you've got thousands of systems and server running, right? Imagine managing that. Even with a lot of people, sometimes, as humans, we have errors, so we can overlook things. So that's going to help us, understand, where's the attack coming from and how we can mitigate that quicker. We can respond to it better. Okay. Here it talks about jump box. So let's look at the picture real quick to make sure that you understand. The majority of the time, you're going to see an infrastructure that's going to have at least one, and in this case, two firewall. Okay, a border gateway firewall, whether they can use variation in the option in the firewall. This thing is going to regulate what's coming in and what's coming out. So we configure the rules on here to block, right, unwanted traffic coming in, right, prevent, right, to block unnecessary traffic, unauthorized traffic coming out. Okay. Now we also implement a web application firewall to really look at the web application side, right? The services, all of the criteria and how elements of the web application would be. The web application firewall would look at things like reject scripts. Okay, it's different than your network traffic firewall. It's going to look at activities and events that is specifically for the web application. So if somebody is trying to do cross-site scripting, it's going to pick it, right? It's going to block it, and it probably, so if they bypass the firewall here, launching a scripting attack against your web application, hopefully will catch that here. That's the goal, right? Okay. And then you're gonna have VPN services, especially for the users that are connecting maybe remotely or even for specific services. So the jump box is used to forward this information to the appropriate server once it comes through the VPN. So let's say that I am a user at home, right? I'm using the company's portal to be able to access possibly a VDI, which is a virtual desktop environment, so that way I can run an application. I do that here for RCCE, right? So I get on the internet through my browser, right? I log on to my employee portal. I click on the VDI, it opens up a virtual machine instance, just like how you load your Kali Linux, right? Or your Windows virtual machine. And then on there, they installed an application for me to use, right? And then, so that means that I have to get through authentication through my network firewall. So after I put in the credential, it validates me, it brings me in, right? And likely that they set up a proxy to send me through virtual private network. And then it gets to the jump box. The jump box will then get me to specific area of my network to access data through that application and so on. So this belongs to a segment environment. You can use a jump box, which is technically just a system, right? It's a server, it's a system that is managing the devices based on the security zone. Casey Wynn uses her laptop, that's from an external network, right? Send it to this virtual private network, this proxy, right? Christian uses a tablet, right? Or a desktop, send it through here. So this is a way that you can set up different zones that would apply to a specific area of your network, so that way they can connect. Now you would have multiple jump boxes, right? And that those jump boxes would then be connected, would be connected to the virtual private network, and it would forward it to the different area of your private network, your critical server systems. Okay. Now, when we say the DMZ, that will be all web front. So you want to be able to control that, right? So the a similar process is that, in order to get on the plane, you have to go through security check, period, right? And in order to get to the security check, you have to have a ticket. So as a user coming in from the internet, you have to have the credential. That's your boarding pass, okay? And then when you get to the security check area, right, you have to have your boarding pass and a valid ID. So what that does is it checks the rules for your requirement to really enter that network, right? So even when you're coming in from virtual private network, it's going to look at the rules, and the security zone rules going to say, okay, now I can forward you to, like the faculty side with the VDI access. I can forward you to the student side, right, to be able to access the student portal and so on. So we can do it that way with the jump box. Any question? Okay. So here it talks about, your physical environment. We emphasize that, these appliances, your network appliances and your security appliances, your cabling, all of those things make up a network, but also you need to make sure that they are physically protected, right? They can't cut the cable, they can't unplug your cable. So we want to make sure we think about that. And then the firewall will control will control what kind of traffic that you would allow. IPS, IDS would either detect or prevent. Now, SDN is very popular now, right? It is a way that we can manage our inventory, set up automation in a lot of the maintenance and support part of our infrastructure operation. So, software-defined network is SDN. Basically, it is a programming network. When I teach CIS 30D, which is Python for networking, it really focuses on SDN. You can implement protocols like SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol, to be able to manage your appliances. So if I have 500 switches and routers, right, I can schedule them to do certain things, right? I can send it, write a loop, and be able to have that automation going for my appliances. So for example, I want to take the configuration from the switch one, right, and then copy that to switch two. Do you really want to manually copy the configuration and then program it into the switch? If you have 500 switches, do you want to do that? Even if you get paid by the 50th switch, you're going to be like, I'm tired, I don't want to do this anymore, right? And likely that the human is going to make a mistake. So what we do is we use a software to be able to interface with the appliances, right? And we can program it for us. So with security configuration, network configuration, automation, whatnot, what you can do is you can implement that so that way you can have more control. Okay. You can also tie in API, especially your security tools. Let's talk about Wireshark, right? If you want to monitor traffic, Wireshark is written in a programming language, right? It tells you, you can look at the source code. You can also use it as an API So what you can do is, when after I configure, I want to be able to launch Wireshark and look for this packet, right? So what you can do is you can use API in the SCN environment. Now, it tells you here that there's always a risk, right? With that, we would know that if you have different type of systems that are made by different manufacturer, right? Um, Through SDN, sometimes that can also create problems. So, that's something that we have to think about whether we want to accept that risk or not. So, for four, how can an organization implement SDN to secure its infrastructure? You can use it to centralize your control through the integration of API. Remember, API has keys, so how you manage your keys are going to be very important in this area because in some cases, right, when you write the script, your system, so if you want the system to do something, you have to authenticate to it. So you have to put in your API key into your script, right? So how you protect that script is important and how that transmitted across the network, right? So if you are not careful, right, somebody gets a hold of that script, they have your API key. I've seen that happen also professionally. Um, and so, it's definitely convenient. It's definitely going to help us centralize control and help us improve a lot of the security operation. And we can use it to detect and prevent. But just like any technology, you are going to have some downfall of that. So, okay. Any question? Okay, so for five, it talks about VDI, which is virtual desktop infrastructure. And this can be used to really virtualize your desktop, your servers, your security appliances, you know, and also containerization to help you either configure, use applications. So as a user, so let's say that you work for a company that has design, okay? And the designer, they need specific software. You can virtualize their desktop. You can use Hyper-V to be able to push the VDI. So when they load it, they see the desktop environment. They click on the application. They can save their file to that VDI. It will update the storage because remember, virtualization is a state system. So whatever that you modify to it, it saves it. It syncs it back into the server, right? The server will have all of these VDIs. And then so if I'm, at home, I can access I can remotely access my VDI again and I can continue the work, right? So that's the goal is to be able to give everybody different desktop infrastructure so that way either we can use the application, we can, you know, manage the network, we can have more control, right? And or we can use containerization. So either it's in the cloud environment or if you are locally hosting this, it works the same. Okay. Any question? Sure. Um, an easier way to think about it. So let's say that I'm trying to see what you use to really. Let's say that I want to manage your application, let's say for your company, okay? And you have 1,000 users, okay? I don't want to install the application on the 1,000 system, okay? Like 1,000 laptop for your company. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual machine. And on that virtual machine, just like your Kali Linux have specific application. I'm going to install the application on there. And I'm going to host that virtual machine on my server. So each user is going to log in, and then they log into my server, my virtualization server. Once they get authenticated, they would be able to access their own version of VDI. So they click an app, they click a little icon, and it opens up their VDI, and on it, it has all the application they need. It's different than roaming profile, it's different than, you know, so that way they don't have to install the application on their home system. They don't have to install their application on the desktop that they work at. They just access the virtual machine. Just like how you download Kali Linux and Kali Linux have a certain set of application, right? It's this. It's a similar concept. Okay, you can customize a lot of these applications for the desktop for the user, and that way you can control the licenses, right? It saves money. You can have more convenient. You can manage the activity and the files that they save because once I use the application on the VDI, it saves it to that instant, and it syncs it back into my server. So all the data that they generate, it retains on that virtual server. You understand? But it's more centralized. So imagine that if instead of downloading Kali Linux every week, you just access Kali Linux from my server, right? You have one, and another student have one, and everybody has a Kali Linux on my server. And then whatever that you modify to yours, right, which is different than another student, it updates it, right? So it's just a more of a centralized way to access the desktop environment. But right now, what you do is you just downloaded, right, a virtualized machine, and then you use a hypervisor to play it. But you still need software. So when you use VDI, of course, you're still going to have to pay for software licenses to access the VDI. So it talks about VDI here. And we talked about containerization before, but instead of virtualization, what you can do is you can use, right, a storage location. You can control that. It will be segregated or protected, and through some product like Kubernetes or Docker, you can configure it to be dedicated for a certain purpose. All right, I'm going to move 5 down in case you're still working on that, and then 6 up. Any question? Okay, so 6, how should an organization secure containers such as Docker or Kubernetes? You would manage the access rights because they are objects, okay? Even though it's through application, when you create that, you need to monitor it as a system and service. And then you need to make sure that because it's using software, like how you in Linux you would do a Docker, right? So you have to install Docker, and that's the software, and then you do a Docker command after that to be able to create, right? To create your Docker. You would be able to patch the application and then the operating system that's using it. That's important. So software updates are essential, and you need to go back and audit. We talked about audit is a way that we would go back and check to see if things are in place, right? If things are missing, then we have to go and fix that. But audit is really a reactive approach, but we still need to audit. And audit is required to to be fulfilling compliance. Okay. So in the virtualization, I think we talked about serverless would function as a service when we talked about cloud before. And then in the next section, it talks about asset management and change management. Um, so I put in some links on how you can, look at some of the tools that can be used. These are some of the common tools that are used to manage assets, like systems, right? So if you have 10,000 systems, you need to tag them if they are above $500 each. So for example, the desktop that you sit at, if you look at the front of it, right? There is a barcode, a label, and that is considered an asset tag. Do they tag things that are less than $500? Depends on the company, but most of the enterprises, $500 and up is a capital investment. So any equipment that comes in, a copier, a desktop, even in a like if you're running a gaming center, your game console that costs more than $500, you have to asset tag, right? And they would be configured in the network. So asset tags allows us to, number one, identify the systems that we own. Two, we need to use the asset tag for the identification to support. So system A would have specific tag for system A. And when it needs RAM replacement, motherboard, replacement, etc., we would refer to the asset tag so that way we can quickly identify the issue of that system. So it really helps us, doing repair, maintenance, support, um, and then it also deters theft for most part because that asset tag really means ownership of that particular system. Okay, when you retire the system, do they necessarily remove? A lot of times they should, but sometimes you see that they don't. I used to contract as a field technician when I first finished my bachelor degree, and I worked for a company that um, also reuse systems. So sometime a company would sell back their system and they would refurbish it. And uh, as a technician, I used to have to bring those equipment, put asset tag on, and be able to connect them. So I see a lot of the systems that are coming in that would be a different technician to refurbish. And then I would go and install the system with the new asset tag. So it is a way for us to really control like which system is being been installed or maintained or support. Any question? Okay, so it talks about that here, right? And then for logging and monitoring, you just want to make sure that you record your incidents. Logs takes up a lot of storage. We want to make sure that we save, right? I don't know if I emphasized this before, but when you manage logs, events, right? A lot of it depends on the security admin. Some people they only look at failed events. That means that like if somebody couldn't log on 5 times, it's gonna log that, right? But if you look at successful event, that is also helpful too. So when you're parsing your log, keep in mind that like attackers, they are gonna do their homework. If they're gonna log in, it's likely gonna be successful, right? If you're brute forcing and failing, right, in the case that they brute force, you would see that in a failed log, right, a failed event. But if they brute force it's correct the first time, it's gonna track that as successful. So when you are digging for logs, you have to kind of think about like well, how does this play out? Is it going to be successful? Is it going to be failed? So I usually would manage both, and keeping both logs is going to take up twice the space, right? So make sure that you don't override logs, because in some systems, what happens is it would store logs, let's say up to 128 meg. A lot of the security appliances, it has minimal storage within. There's not a lot of storage. It's gonna tell you the logs it's gonna keep is like this much. And if you don't back it up, it's just gonna write it over. Okay? So when it fills up, what's gonna happen is it's gonna go back and it's gonna rewrite over the storage space. So you've got to make sure that you back it up, right? And you would centralize that, and then you want to make sure that it's secure. That means that you have to control permission to the logs. Who has access to the logs? Okay. And they typically would have log servers. This servers basically just store all logs. And so if you're using a Bastion host, this is a remote log server. Basically, it's going to make sure that your logs stay intact, right? And there is monitoring for analysis purposes. So I'm going to tell you right now, as an analyst, this is what you're going to do. Not be too interesting, just looking at logs all the time. Right. So what you're gonna see is you are going to access these systems, and so for the remote log server, that's typically just a Bastion host. Okay, so for A, the role of Bastion host in event logging, right, is used as a remote log server. We should centralize it for monitoring and analysis purposes. And that means that all your system logs would be sent to a central server. Okay? And then for the remote central server, that would be a Bastion host. So even if you have cloud, right, we still want so let's say that I own a company and I have local infrastructure, right? I have my server racks, my critical systems, my private network, but I also have cloud as another area of my infrastructure. I can use that for web hosting and all of those things. I still need to bring those logs back into my log server. And then if you want to have a remote log server, but make sure that you manage security and access for the logs and the server itself. Okay. At the beginning, we talked about how we should implement encryption for data protection. That's, one. Oops, sorry. To click that, I need to click this. Oh, here, right, for configuration management and validation, right now you can use Microsoft. If you use Microsoft servers, you can use Intune. Intune is great. It helps you manage application that's installed on different endpoint systems. But Intune recently have vulnerabilities, so if you're using Intune, you just gotta make sure that you check the vulnerability. There are other options in software. Intune Microsoft Endpoint Manager with Intune can also be used for change management. But Microsoft Manager in general, I think the change management systems can be integrated with different software. So I didn't want to expand on encryption because the basics in encryption is another class, right? Encryption is just a way that we want to protect data so that way it is not visible to the unauthorized user. So what do we encrypt? We encrypt part of our network, right? You don't want to encrypt everything because I think encryption use processes, so you have to have the resources to be able to manage that. If you encrypt everything on your network, right, that's going to cost delay to the resources. You have to have all the server system to process the encryption. You hear about cryptocurrency, right? Blockchain. So it is a network that use encryption, and blockchain is not necessarily new. It's actually built a long time ago. It just implemented for cryptocurrency because of Bitcoin, it blew up, right? But if you know about blockchain performance and the technology, it's slow. Okay? So uh, what you see is that you are gonna, you can encrypt the actual system or the data content on the system, but select the right encryption that is effective for your needs, right? And then how you use your key or transfer your key or store your key, and then the decrypted data is important. Okay. And with certificates, so for 9, it says, how should we manage encryption and digital certificates in our infrastructure? We want to protect our encryption key. We want to control permission for our decrypted data. So once you encrypt, you use encryption to encrypt data to protect that data. Once it's decrypted, you want to make sure that you also have the protection for it, and because it is an object, there are files on your system. We want to make sure that we have proper permission. And then if it's transmitted across the network or external to you, which I don't recommend for decrypted data to be transmitted, but if it's in transit, right, we want to make sure that it is appropriately controlled. That means that it's intended for specific system or user, and so we want to make sure that we have tools and approaches or strategies for that. Certificate is really a file that your system refers to for specific things. It could be like access permission. It could be so when you go access a secure website, many of these websites and web applications require certificate. A lot of them have lifetime certificate, never expires, right? Because they are public website, and you can put in your credential to access a secure website. Now through that, what you would see is if I need to manage my certificate, I need to have a certificate authority. A CA is a server. It's a system that control which certificate is being used, how long, when is the expiration, the content of the certificate. Now, as you know, you probably read about attacks that they modify the certificate or create fake certificate. That can also happen, right? But so if you centralize your certificate and control that central point, right, you would be able to see more on how your certificate is issued, revoked, right, and managed. Especially when you're using certificate with vendors. Microsoft requires one, right? Other entities, software wise, we know that certificates is necessary. And so in the case that if the keys goes to the wrong hand, right, or it's been changed, then we would know because it logs it as well. If your certificate been modified, if the change in the integrity of the certificate has been modified, you would know, right? So we want to make sure that we centralize that. And you want to manage the lifetime of your certificate And in the case, if you have expired certificate, for example, for a web application, people cannot access that web application, right? It will tell you that you need to renew your certificate, otherwise they won't have access. So some of that has to play with your encryption for that particular web application as well. Question? Okay. 10, it asks you to explain how active defense can help the organization in security posture. We want to be active and proactive. So this is going to help us, number one, control damage to attack. I don't necessarily think that countering the adversaries is an ethical approach, right? But what it's saying there is that you want to be, so if they're launching denial of service attack, you need to respond to it by not attacking back. Okay, that doesn't mean that it attacks back. So if you are attacking back, then you are not ethical, right? It doesn't give us the privilege to do that. What you need to do is you need to respond to it. That means that you need to look at that service, disable that service so that way that you are not highly impacted by that particular attack. So countering adversaries doesn't mean that you are launching an attack back to the attacker. No, that doesn't mean like that, right? So we want to make sure that we are containing that attack. We want to perform threat intelligence. So if you are facing incident like that, we want to understand that threat. How high or deep, right? So in the SOC, that's what you're doing. Incident response, that's all about like, oh, I have an attack, right? What is the level of threat? And how can I stop this? Okay? Now, post attack, you're still going to have to do threat intelligence. So if you don't know about the threat, potentially you are at risk again. So we want to be able to understand the threat, right? The potential impact or the current impact. And then we also sometimes would do threat hunting. Sometimes that threat might not be known, right? There might be a abnormal activity or behavior in the system, uh, being reported by the user or the company. And you want to be able to identify that threat and be able to see how you can stop it. So countermeasure really means that we want to be able to prevent it from acting up again or doing damages. And the proactive part is we have to continue to evaluate. That means what for you? As an analyst, that means continuous vulnerability assessment. And vulnerability assessment sometimes would entail running tools and scanning, right? Um, Knowing how and what kind of tools to be used for what. Continue to monitor and adjust the control based on that. This is an evolving engine. It never stops. So if you're looking for a job that's going to be days in, days out the same, this is not the field. Okay? We want to be thinking about, oh, okay, that vulnerability happens to company ABC and it could happen to us because we're using that product. So that means that we're going to evaluate our system and see where do we start. How are we going to plan to make sure that it doesn't happen to us, right? And that's what pays your check, is to be more proactive about it and having the knowledge and skills to do that. Okay, any question regarding active defense? So this could be an interview question, right? Say, okay, you passed your CYSA, you applied to be an analyst in my company. can you tell me what kind of approach you're going to be doing to actively defending my network and my systems, right? So this is more of like a summary. You can give them the breakdown, some example to follow up. Keep your answer within 5 to 7 minutes, right? Because that shows that you really, really know. Okay. All right. 11. So let's flip back to the notes. Certificate and encryption is on page 4. Active defense is following that on page 4. Honeypot is the short section after that. So when we did the showdown lab not last week, but the week before, right, in lab 4, you saw that there was honeypots. Okay, they're all over. A lot of them would have your general web server kind of environment. Sometimes they would put files on there that maybe contain passwords to kind of lure people. So the whole goal in setting up a honeypot is to make it attractive, right? To get the to lure in the attacker to look at your systems and to establish a trend or understand what kind of threat that would be potentially impacting your network. So, one, it's probably going to monitor traffic and it will contain some information. Now, out of the box, I think we're going to use Petbox today. And Petbox, you can just set it up in a few steps. But you can just manually set up a honeypot. Instead of using one package to do that. So for 11, why honeypots can be used in infrastructure to really understand attacker attempts and traffic, possibly learn about their techniques and tools. Um, to and then from there we can look at the behavior and the trend and we can implement appropriate solutions to countermeasure. So but my advice is if you're going to set up honeypot, set it up on the systems that are um, isolated from or segmented from your critical systems, of course, right? A lot of the times you see this public front system, so that way you can have um, external attractiveness to the internet. So publicly, you would see that typically set up as a web server. Okay. We talked about cloud in the prior chapters. We talked about cloud access security broker, right? It asks you how should CASB be used in this should be used in infrastructure security. Typically, it's just a way that we can implement rules on how resources and services are used, what is allowed and what's not allowed. So this is an area for cloud that you can integrate or you can access through your cloud service to be able to protect your cloud resources. Okay? And then following that talks about virtual private cloud, your VPC. This is on demand and semi isolated environment. This allows you to set up your cloud system in a virtual segmented area. So, If your package includes this, right, or you can look at this as an option to be able to integrate. And the suggestion that if you're using VPC, make sure that you have private subnet and secure communication. So what does that mean, right? Most of the things are still on IPv4. So if you are setting up networks for VPC, even because it's cloud, it's still a network, right? That means that you are using network systems, appliances, and server that is provided by the service provider like Amazon or Microsoft. They are gonna you can implement IP scheme and subnet it to where you can have segmentation, right? We already know if you're using, like, if you IP subnet, right, your subnet mask, your CIDR, and your IP addresses play a very important key in segmentation, even on for VLAN within. Um, and then using services that allows your system to securely communicate. So some part of the security communication means that the services might have encryption that is equipped with it, and so on. So um, think about that. So to assess cloud, right? I put down that you can use third-party audit information. Sometimes your service provider also would give you the resources, but if you want to look at management tools for shared risks, I put down some information there for you. Let's bring 12 down. And 13 and 14 out. So for 13, it asks you to provide multiple examples for preventative, detective, and corrective control. So preventative is we want to stop it from happening before it happens, right? Detective is the alarm that sounds off, so notification that you receive when it happens. And then corrective is that after it happened, how can you fix it so it doesn't happen again? So preventative control, these are only a couple examples. One thing that you can do is firewall, right? Having appropriate, I shouldn't say appropriate, effective firewall rule that is really going to allow you to control, could be traffic, resources that are being used, or services that are being used in your systems and networks. So setting up access control lists using whitelisting for your firewall, and then implement training. I think having knowledge and awareness is going to help you along the way. People can report. We talked about how sometimes, people make mistakes because they don't know. So annual training or quarterly training, whichever would be appropriate for the company or what they want to pay for. Detective control are your alarm system, like building alarm system, right? For theft, um, detection, and then your intrusion detection system. That could be network or host. And detective can also be humans, right? So if you train people appropriately, they would notify or they would report the information. Okay? So that's important. And then corrective control, things like anti-malware application, once it sees the malware, it's going to try to contain the malware so that way the malware doesn't affect other system files or cause more damage, unless it's ransomware. um, or patching. When you're running updates, that is a way that we can correct the system flaws or issues. Now, for 14, it's not limited to this, right? It might sound like a long list, but remember, this is a layered approach. And in a defense in depth, you are going to have many components. So we can start with access management, maybe using strong authentication. Then we can go into preventative, right? And then we can go in. So you can, when you look at the 13, you need to think about how you can bring some of those things from 13 into 14. So access management, we can do strong authentication. We can set up firewall, and host-based firewall just means that you have application firewall that's installed like your Windows firewall, okay, or Linux firewall. You can also use network firewall. And then your host-based intrusion prevention system, that's like your security application on your computer. Data loss prevention, DLP, is important. And through data loss, we will be able to think about, like, how if we're using encryption, how can we prevent that data being leaked? And then your access control list. So ACL doesn't belong to only firewall, right? A lot of times some students think that ACL is only for firewall, but access control list belongs to also permissions and privileges, right? User rights. So when you right click a file and click on permissions, what you see is that that's an access control list. Who can have access to that file, which group, which user, right? So a lot of the systems have components that you can manage access control lists. So when we manage access control lists for the system activity, that is considered user rights or privileges, okay? But when you manage access control lists for files and folders, that's called permissions. So, when you manage access control for your network, right, that's part of your activity and traffic. A lot of the time when we say whitelisting, that's what's allowed, blacklisting, what is rejected. If you use blacklisting, you have to keep going, okay? This actually streamlined for us where we would only allow. And then you can modify it if there's something that needs to be added. We talked about using anti-malware and corrective control in the previous question, and then patch management and vulnerability assessment. So patch management allows us to also corrective, right? And then for vulnerability assessment, that's also going to allow us to do corrective, along with, in the long run, it's going to become preventative. I really feel that if you close out your vulnerability, you are going to be a little bit ahead in how, you can prevent things like zero-day attacks and other things. Now, system hardening doesn't only mean updates. A lot of people say, oh, I update, and it is part of system hardening. But it's about configuring your system so that way it is stronger and better, right? So we can configure things, simple things, like if you think about it, turn off your services that you don't use, turn off Bluetooth, right? disable things that you don't need, uninstall apps that you don't use. Those things belong to system hardening. And then your permissions, encryption, monitor your file integrity, so hash checking. Look at event logs in Windows environment. We can look at event viewer. We can look at anomalies in our network or security anomalies in SIEM. And then look at physical access control. So if you are thinking about physical access control detective, right, look at your surveillance systems like cameras and so on. And then if you are, you know, you can set up preventative actions like having locks, barricades, turnstiles, different things. So physical access control there. Okay, so now you can look at page 5 for those things. It talks about preventative control, detective control, and corrective, and then host security, which is what we just went over. And the three things that a lot of people emphasize that is an area for security is really policy, process, and standards, right? I taught upper division classes, and a lot of times they get them mixed up. I asked them to write a policy and they give me procedure, right? So policies are rules that are listed, and we use those rules for configuration management and change management. So process are considered like steps and actions. So when you're thinking about a sales terminal, a process is the user press the start button and scan an item, right? That's a process, okay? So the process of buying something has sub-processes. So what you think is in operation, we think about like the goals of the business and break it down into process. And through that, you're going to see different areas of security that we can implement. And then standards are going to be tied to the practices that we fulfill to make sure that we meet either industry standard, regulated standards, right? Government standards. It depends on your company. So with this, your security design, and for those of you who aspire to be a consultant, when we design security, it is a lot of different elements, right? You need to think about configuration and change management. So there are tools that you can use for this, but a lot of the times we think about if you can reconfigure or configure, you are going to have change in your system, right? And we want to be able to monitor. We want to also work with personnel for training. You need to have business continuity, so your BCP, disaster recovery plan, right? And then this is also going to help you with the human factor. Okay, so in analysis for the infrastructure, these are just general terms that they are referred to, which is the next question. So for 15, it says in analyzing the infrastructure, identify appropriate view based on the given activities. A, examine occurrences or incidents or and events based on the current or historical data. So let's say that I'm responding to an incident now. I see an event, right, and it's maybe somebody is attacking a server, right? They're not doing denial of service attack, and that is operational view. Why? Because it's part of the operation. If you don't have any kind of attacks and you going back and you looking at logs and you're trying to see how many attacks you have in the last year or the last 5 years, right? That's still going to be occurrences that you see in operational view. Then, if you're looking at your network design and your network diagram to see weaknesses, because a lot of that stem from your network design, that is considered a logical view. How I remember this is network diagram is logical. It's a way that we portray a network through picture, right? Identifying our systems that are interconnected, and we call that logical diagrams. So how your data flow into your network and outside your network. So that's a logical view. And then C, evaluate your system configuration, settings, and services in the infrastructure. So anything that deals with configuration and settings, that's part of technical view. Any question for number 5? I mean, 15. You can look at the trends in operations. So let's say that I look at the trend for network outages, which is part of availability in the last month, right? Based on historical activities in the last month to really understand what's coming next month, right? So that is because it's part of operation. You know occurrences, events, and things that's in your operation that's operational. Okay, 16. How can an organization reduce human errors in the infrastructure? Um, Automate a lot of these notification and monitoring because even the top expert, you are going to have errors. Okay. So we can automate that and we can create an automation process. You can develop it. That could be scripting that we talked about implementing with APIs, right? So the machine is going to be instructed to do specific things. So your margin of error is less. Constraining interface to allow only permitted activities. So we want to really think about like what the user, what people, what system can access. I gave this example on Monday. Um, I know most of you know what Coinstar does, right? It's a machine that you deposit your coins in, it counts your coins up, it gives you a receipt, you can go and switch it for credit or money and stuff, right? But if you know when you go to the machine, you can only press start, right? And then put your coin into where you deposit, flip the tray, and then it counts your coins, right? But in the back, it runs your Windows system, okay? It is a Windows OS. It has components. So for the technician that does the service, it is still an OS in the back. All machines have OSs from, I don't know, maybe some of you remember Redbox. Redbox is out now, right? I've seen some machines that do other things like play music and stuff. All of those are embedded systems. So what happens is with Coinstar, they are constraining the interface. When you go to drive-through or walk up to, those screens that you can order, right, your fast food item like at McDonald's, right? They are constraining you to that interface, okay, or do self-checkout, right? Self-checkout, they have improved the process in this. When I was doing my dissertation, I thought about like improving the process and technology, which a lot of PhD actually, think about, right? Um, and so what you think is like the simple process, but it is not. Because if you go to certain self checkout, it's very cumbersome. Like you have to press this to go here to go here, but now they kind of streamlined it. So because if you give them more activities to do, it might cause confusion and it opens up access to other things, right? Imagine if you go to Coinstar and it's a Windows environment. You have to click the app, open it up, type in your name, and then log in and all of those things. Nobody is going to want to do that, right? So we want to really think about convenience and we want to think about the activities that are relevant and permitted. Um, Implement procedure check for separation of duty. So uh, never give someone in a central role that role only, right? We want to make sure that there's someone to check them. And that's what SOD really needs. People need to take vacation, right? The people who don't take vacation, likely that they're committing fraud. Statistically, are shown that. Um, and so making sure that we have other personnel procedures in place, like performance review, training requirement, and so on. So that's going to bring us to the next bullet. Any question? Okay. Last question. The activities and infrastructure for security maintenance. So, what if you implemented security already, right? What's the after? You need to go back and review. Okay. And a lot of that is audit. So, a lot of the companies they hire consultants like myself or external consultant to auditors to come in and check. Some of that is compliant requirement. Some of it is because they want to know. Because sometimes when you're within the organization and you work with that infrastructure regularly, you might not see some of the things that other external entities see. Um, so it's more clear cut because you might bypass. So we want to have a periodic review on the security plan and the implementation solution. We want to also have a process on continual improvement. One of the things that most analysts do is vulnerability assessment. That's going to be part of your job primarily. Active vulnerability assessment and continual improvement vulnerability assessment. Okay, threat detection, all of those things. Um, and then if things that were old and we don't need it anymore, we would need to retire the process and or policies, right? So I used to talk to the bachelor students. I said, one thing about policy is if you implement new technology, you need to set the rules. It's kind of like in your household, if you have new people living there, you're gonna tell them the rules in your house. Like, do not come after midnight because everyone's sleeping, right? Because they don't know the rules of operation. So whenever that you have new technology, you need to make sure that your rules are set. If you retire technology, you need to consider changing the rule or removing that rule, right? Because years from now, we will not need passwords, I hope, right? That's a big problem for a lot of our systems. Because we should be transitioning to a lot of the times now biometrics. We still use password locker with biometrics, right? And it took us decades to get here. But what we see is that if it's not no longer relevant, don't implement it, don't use it, right? It's just a waste of effort there. And then we still have to document the retired process because sometimes you have to investigate, you have to go back and look, uh, and so on. Any question? So I told my Thursday class that the other day that the application for DoD just opened. If you're interested in that, but maybe I can pull that up during the break. So if some of you are interested in their internship, they also have internship for high school students too. So if you have family members that are that's interested in the security or IT, they have Sundays. Okay, let's stop. Do you have any questions for me? No?